Okay, let's talk about initiation and self-initiation. So cultures traditionally, and if you study different tribal groups, different ethnic groups, different traditions around the world, will have some kind of initiation. This is where the child becomes an adult, and in that, there's usually something that's quite intense, some sort of suffering, and there's a before and after. Yeah, so even though childhood may sort of gradually become adulthood, there's a rite of passage. Yeah, there's a rite of passage. And I don't know, famous one, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, and in Jewish tradition, for example, various tribal groups will usually have some sort of pain, some sort of trial. There'll often be scarification. There may well be tattoos. There may be, something scary, like being all night alone in the jungle. There's one tribe that uses fire ants. Some tribes do like bungee jumping when they have to show their bravery. Some sort of get whipped. Being cut is quite common. There's a sort of scariness to it. There's a sort of often a sort of ripping away from, usually from the mother, the boys. Girls, often it's considered like the onset of puberty and child rearing, which usually happens relatively young in tribal cultures. That in itself is often the initiation for girls. So this is often more for the boys. They're taken from their mothers, who sort of scream and cry and pretend they don't want it to happen, but if they've got half any sense at all, they actually do want it to happen. So it's almost like an act. Sometimes sort of men abduct the children, will take them to the woods or take them away somewhere scary, the mountains or whatever. They might have to hunt a lion. I think there's one tribe in Kenya that used to do that. I don't think they still do. They might have to do something, stay out in the cold for a few days. Different trials, ordeals, and then they come back and they're welcomed into the tribe, and they have to put down the sort of childish things of childhood, put down their toys. They have a part of the able to go say hunting with the men or whatever it is, and this is missing from the West. This is missing from the West. So what that leads to is a sort of infantilism, where people are perpetual children. And in some ways, I think this suits governments. Governments are the sort of perpetual mother, as it were. If you look to the response to the Chinese thing, for example, you'll see that there is this sort of maternal, it's not like paternal, it's maternal. We want what's best for you, so we're going to have to keep you safe, so you have to do as you're told. You can't go outside, it's too dangerous to play out there, that kind of attitude. So if people are perpetually children, the state can look after you, and all it requires is to control you at the same time. So in some ways, it's sort of no surprise that the state, which is not a tribal institution, which has grown in the West from something relatively small and that had a purpose that was probably noble and beautiful, to something that's way out of control. So that maternal, uninitiated, sort of rural, perpetual children continues. What does that look like? Well, two things you'll see. One is just very childish behaviours. Increasingly, I have this sort of felt sense from men, I always want to do this in the UK, that they just feel like babies. There's something about them that doesn't feel grown up, particularly when you've been around men that are a little bit more masculine. There's something about them that's childlike, and you'll see, and the sort of decadent behaviours are often there too. A child will eat sweets until it's sick, kind of thing. And you see, I was watching just like guys getting drunk. I was in Bath yesterday. It was a beautiful English city, actually. Really stunning English city. And it was a Friday night, and there's a bunch of guys sort of getting drunk, and it just looked kind of childish, looked kind of baby-like, or playing computer games, or doing, I'm not against necessarily particular activities, so it's hard to name, but it's the feeling, the attitude towards them. And one of the complaints I hear most often from my female students is, where are the grown-up men? Where are the adult men? They just feel like they're just around boys. That's how they feel. As women, I just hear that complaint so often. And also, if you look at culture, men are often infantilized even more. So it'll be the sort of bumbling dad in the advert who kind of can't get anything right, and the woman's the adult who sort of sort of puts things in place, kind of thing. You'll see that in a lot of modern media, modern movies as well, actually, sort of childlike, bumbling, boyish male characters. The other thing you'll see is an attempt to self-initiate. So in England, where I live, a common area of young boys driving cars in very dangerous ways. Tattooing is a ridiculous trend amongst young people. It's really, like when I was young, tattooing is something sort of, bikers and kind of badasses might have done. Maybe if you're in the military, you had one. I mean, tattoos have many meanings for any individual. So, if you're out there and you've got a tattoo, don't get offended. And the trend as a society to tattooing and increasingly extreme kinds of tattooing and piercing to become so popular. I mean, that just looks like an attempted self-initiation, an attempted self-initiation. So what else? Other dangerous behaviors, drug and alcohol addiction could be another one, right? Sometimes initiations have drugs and alcohol in them in traditional societies where there's a sort of altered state and you kind of have a vision, or, you do fasting to achieve that, for example, would be another classic one. So yeah, that initiation is lacking. And I think it leads to dire consequences, both in terms of how we relate to the state as a kind of parent, our lack of robustness, our lack of purpose, our lack of integration in the community, our lack of maturity, the drug and alcohol issues. These things are pretty serious. And yeah. It's interesting, at 43, I feel I've had a couple of initiations. One was doing martial arts training where it's sort of with older men and it's quite intense. And, my black belt, for example, is kind of a rite of passage. And then was working in Ukraine last year. And I really saw that amongst young Ukrainians. I don't think it's just a male thing in the context. Like classically, this is considered like men's work. But actually, I think it really applies to women as well in the modern context. Because in the West, gender's much more balanced, more fluid, for better and for worse. So I think I saw young women in Ukraine just stunningly, through making something bigger of themselves, being of service, sort of go from sort of Instagram yoga girls to, women that really had this path and this maturity to them in a very short space of time. I saw that 6 months to a year working with the team. Phenomenal women. And I think that experience for me was initiatory, as well as some pretty hardcore psychedelic use at times as well. And it was a sort of a feeling at sort of in my 40s of sort of going, shit, I'm an adult. How did that happen? And it feels so late in life. It feels so late to sort of wake up and go, fuck, why did I not have something that did this to me deliberately when I was 20 or even younger? It's 14 in some cultures. So, yeah, it's been really on my mind. And the palestra training, if you're interested, we're putting together, it's essentially an initiation into Western culture. It's one of the main things I'm doing with this work, aside from this channel and just putting ideas out there. It's taking some people into the woods and really doing a very, very strong initiation for people. And yeah, death meditation, essentially. I won't give you all the details, that ruin the surprise. But that I think, it's in the early stages, but that could be useful. Could be useful. Okay, so there's some thoughts on initiation, on self-initiation. How might we do that in the West? I'm developing things myself. Others are. Men's work, this is a thing. I think we haven't yet got the answer. We haven't got yet the answer. And in a sort of culture that's very much health and safety, it's kind of, some things get kind of tricky in a kind of health and safety culture, that maternal culture that tries to look after everyone and tries to, treats from kids. There's sort of forms you have to fill out for every little scratch a kid has in school these days, apparently. It was beginning when I was young, and apparently it's really gone through the roof since then, and that kind of continues right into the workplace, where you have to fill out an accident form if it's a tiny little scratch, and you have to have a training to use a hammer in case you're not hammer trained. I remember one of my jobs having to be hammer trained, and I was like, really? This is a thing? That's the maternal attitude. And we saw that the last few years with keep everyone safe, no matter what. That avoids the confrontation with death, which is essentially what initiation in some form is. It's a confrontation with death. It's also a sort of earning of the culture. It's like you have to suffer to earn a place at the table here in this Western culture, which is beautiful. We're just given it, so people take it for granted and then end up not appreciating it, having a lack of gratitude, a lack of perspective on the wonderful part, the wonderful culture they're in, actually, because they haven't earned it in any way. There's no way. They haven't done, national service may have done this. I know a lot of people are fans of that, and there's a place for that perhaps again. A sense of earning to be a part of it. You know, I think that's why initiations do involve suffering. They do involve coming out of the culture, confronting death, suffering, and then coming back into it. Just a few thoughts on initiation.